The sun was setting as I arrived at the campsite, the trees towering like silent sentinels around us. I was with 3 friends, all eager for a weekend in the great outdoors. We set up our tents near the edge of the woods, joking about our earlier discussions of urban legends and ghost stories. As night fell, the laughter died down, and a stillness enveloped us around the crackling campfire. We shared tales of horror, each story more spine-chilling than the last. I noticed that the woods felt different as darkness settled in. The wind whispered through the branches, creating an eerie symphony that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I dismissed it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After a while, we decided to explore a nearby trail rumored to lead to an old, abandoned cabin. The thrill of the unknown called to us, and we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight flickered as we walked deeper into the woods, shadows stretching and contorting around us. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. As we approached the cabin, the air grew colder, and the oppressive darkness closed in around us. The cabin loomed before us, a decaying structure shrouded in vines and mystery. The front door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Old furniture lay scattered, and the floorboards creaked beneath our weight. My friend Sarah pointed to something on the wall. "Look at this," she said, shining her flashlight on a series of strange symbols etched into the wood. They looked ancient, worn by time. As we examined them, I felt a chill creep down my spine. A strange sensation filled the room, as if we were not alone. Ignoring the rising unease, we took turns exploring the cabin, each of us finding peculiar items: a rusted knife, a tattered book filled with cryptic writing. Just as I was about to read a passage aloud, a loud bang echoed from outside, making us jump. We rushed to the window, peering into the inky blackness, but saw nothing. "Let's head back," I suggested, the atmosphere pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Reluctantly, we agreed, and as we stepped outside, I felt a strange compulsion to look back at the cabin. That's when I saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light of our flashlights. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as we hurried back to camp. I shared what I had seen, and my friends laughed it off, attributing it to the overactive imaginations that came with the dark woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us from the shadows. The night wore on, and we sat around the fire, but the tales of horror now felt far too real. A few minutes later, I felt a sudden urge to step away from the fire, to get some fresh air. As I walked toward the edge of the clearing, I heard a whisper. It was faint, but clear enough to send chills down my spine. I turned to my friends, but they were still laughing, oblivious. I followed the sound, moving deeper into the trees, and there it was again, a soft, pleading whisper. "Help me." My breath quickened as I moved cautiously toward it, heart pounding. As I reached a small clearing, the whispers stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I turned to head back, but something caught my eye. There, sprawled on the ground, was a doll. It was old and weathered, its button eyes gleaming eerily in the light. As I bent down to pick it up, the air grew icy, and a sudden rush of wind swept through the trees, extinguishing my flashlight. I fumbled in the dark, panic rising in my chest. Just then, I heard a loud crash from the direction of our campsite, followed by my friends screaming. I ran, adrenaline fueling my escape. When I burst into the clearing, the scene was chaos. The fire was out, tents were torn, and my friends were huddled together, eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. They looked at me, horrified. "It was there," one friend shouted, pointing into the darkness. "A woman, she was just standing there." I turned to where they pointed, and then I saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. It was the same figure I had seen at the cabin. It turned, its face obscured, and slowly stepped into the shadows. "We need to go," I urged, my heart racing. We gathered our things and fled into the night, the chilling whispers trailing behind us. As we stumbled through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just running from a ghost but from something much more sinister. As we finally reached our car, we collapsed inside, panting and terrified. I glanced back at the dark woods and saw the doll on the ground, its button eyes glinting in the moonlight. But then I noticed something chilling. The doll was no longer alone. There were more dolls scattered through the trees, each one staring right at me. It was supposed to be a fun weekend camping trip with friends, just a break from our usual routine. We drove out to the woods, eager to set up our tents and spend a couple of nights under the stars. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees as we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. It was all in good fun until I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. That first night, as we sat around the flickering flames, a strange feeling washed over me. I could have sworn I felt eyes watching us from the darkness. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild, a byproduct of the stories we were telling. The crackling of the fire masked the sounds of the forest, and soon, laughter filled the air as the mood lightened. As the fire burned low, my friends began to drift off to their tents, leaving me and Amy, my closest friend, by the fire. She looked at me, a nervous smile on her face, and suggested we go for a short walk to stretch our legs. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we ventured deeper into the woods, away from the campsite. The trees closed in around us, and the darkness seemed to thicken. We walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches. I felt the unease creeping back. It was too quiet, too still. Suddenly, we heard a distant scream, a blood-curdling sound that sent shivers down my spine. It echoed through the trees, chilling my bones. I grabbed Amy's arm, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her face pale. We turned back toward the campsite, but just as we began to walk, something darted through the underbrush. A flash of movement caught my eye, and I froze. It was a shadow, darting away too quickly for me to see what it was. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen in place. "Let's go back," Amy urged, her voice trembling. I nodded, and we hurried back toward the campsite, adrenaline pumping through our veins. When we reached our tents, I noticed something unsettling. Our things were scattered around, the tent flaps were slightly open, and it looked like someone had rummaged through our belongings. A wave of panic washed over me. Had someone been watching us? We gathered our things quickly, whispering about what to do next. Suddenly, from the darkness beyond the campsite, we heard a low growl, a sound that sent our hearts racing. I felt my pulse quicken as a figure stepped out from the trees. It was tall, and naturally thin, and moved with a predatory grace. The light from the fire illuminated its features, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, fixed directly on us. It was not human, but I could see something familiar in its features, something that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, pulling Amy with me. We retreated toward the fire, which now felt like our only protection. "Get the others!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. Amy ran back to wake our friends, and I faced the creature alone, trying to look brave even as my heart raced. It took a step forward, the growl vibrating in the air. Just then, the others emerged from their tents, blinking in confusion. They stared at the creature, and for a moment, we all stood frozen in disbelief. Suddenly, the creature threw its head back and let out a scream that echoed through the trees. In that moment, it seemed to realize it was outnumbered. It turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. We huddled together, shaking and wide-eyed, discussing what to do next. A few moments later, Amy looked down and gasped. The creature had left something behind, a torn piece of fabric, and I recognized it instantly. It was from my jacket, the one I had lost last winter in a freak accident while hiking alone in the same woods. The realization crashed over me like a wave. This creature had been following me for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. I shivered, looking at my friends. We quickly gathered our things and left the campsite, vowing never to return. The woods had felt like a safe escape at first, but now they were tainted with a chilling truth. The creature hadn't just been watching us, it had been waiting for me. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, just a quick weekend getaway in the mountains. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the forest around us thick and quiet. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a break from the stress of everyday life. My friend Amy and I found the perfect spot near a small clearing, set up our tent, and gathered wood for the fire. The day passed in easy conversation, laughing and enjoying the fresh air. As evening settled in, the forest became eerily still. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making every small sound seem unnaturally loud. We sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing old stories. Amy's phone had no signal, but we didn't care. We were off the grid, and that was part of the fun. Or so we thought. Sometime after midnight, the fire had burned low, and we were ready to call it a night. The moon was full, casting strange shadows through the trees, making them look like figures creeping around us. Just as I was zipping up the tent flap, there was a noise in the distance. A sharp crack, like a tree branch breaking, followed by a low growl. Amy and I froze, exchanging a quick glance. We both stood still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, a snapping of twigs and what sounded like something being dragged through the underbrush. My stomach tightened, and I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. Probably an animal, Amy whispered, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I nodded, even though something about the noise didn't sit right with me. We crawled into the tent, trying to shake off the tension, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle outside, every movement of the wind through the trees felt like something or someone was watching us. Hours passed, and I finally started to drift off when a scream split the night. It was loud, desperate, and close. My eyes snapped open, heart racing. Amy sat up beside me, eyes wide with fear. We both held our breath, straining to hear what came next. For a few moments, nothing. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling. I didn't want to look, but I knew we couldn't just sit there. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, poking the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. But there was nothing there, no sign of anything. I stepped out of the tent, trying to keep my breathing steady, but the oppressive silence made it hard to think clearly. Amy followed me, gripping a large stick sheet found by the fire pit. We stood there, waiting, listening. Then we heard it again. The footsteps were right behind us. Spinning around, the flashlight beam landed on a figure, standing just a few feet away. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore a torn coat, his face obscured by a hood. He held something large and heavy in his hand, dragging it through the dirt. My stomach twisted when I realized it was an axe. He was mumbling something, his words incoherent, like a low chant. His head tilted toward us, but he didn't move any closer. He just stood there, staring. Amy's grip tightened on the stick, but we were both frozen, and sure of what to do. Suddenly, without warning, the man lifted the axe above his head and let out another scream, this one more guttural, more animal than human. We bolted, running as fast as we could through the trees. My heart pounded in my ears as we weaved through the dark forest, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. I could hear Amy's breath beside me, ragged and panicked, but we didn't dare look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the tree line, stumbling into a small clearing. We stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old stump, and embedded in it was the axe. It was the same one the man had been carrying, gleaming in the moonlight. How did? Amy started, but she didn't finish. Neither of us could explain how the axe had gotten there before us. We didn't waste any more time. We ran until we reached the main road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man, didn't ask many questions, but he could see the fear in our eyes. He dropped us off near our campsite, where we quickly packed up our gear and got out of there. The whole way home, neither of us spoke much about what had happened. We didn't tell anyone, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that man, his chilling scream, and how the axe had beaten us to the clearing. Whoever he was, he had let us go, and I still don't know why. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the campsite. My friends and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. We set up our tents, started a fire, and cracked open some drinks. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves, but as night fell, an unsettling tension filled the air. As darkness enveloped us, we gathered around the fire, swapping ghost stories and laughing nervously. I felt a strange thrill listening to tales of campers who had gone missing or strange creatures lurking in the woods. My friend Tom, with his typical bravado, laughed off every story, claiming they were nothing but urban legends. But then, something unusual happened. Around midnight, just as we were finishing up our last round of s'mores, we heard a loud rustling in the bushes behind our campsite. The laughter faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Everyone turned their heads toward the sound, but the forest remained dark and still. I squinted into the trees, my heart racing. The shadows seemed to shift. Tom, trying to break the tension, jumped up and waved a flashlight around, announcing that he was going to investigate. "It's probably just a deer or something," he said, attempting to sound brave. We all knew better than to follow him into the darkness. Instead, we settled back, feigning laughter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the minutes ticked by, we heard Tom's footsteps crunching on the leaves. Suddenly, he let out a startled yelp that echoed through the woods. The sound wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It was as if something was chasing him. We jumped to our feet, panic rising in our throats. "Tom, are you okay?" I shouted, my voice cracking. There was no response. Instead, the rustling grew louder, and a figure darted past the edge of the firelight. My heart dropped. It was tall and hunched, moving with an unnatural speed. "Get inside the tents!" I screamed, grabbing my flashlight and shining it toward the darkness. The beam revealed nothing. The figure vanished, swallowed by the trees. My friends and I scrambled for the tents, fear coursing through our veins. We zipped ourselves in, trying to control our racing hearts. Inside the cramped tent, we huddled together, whispering frantically. I felt a deep sense of dread. Was it just a prank? Had Tom gotten too scared and run off? Minutes felt like hours as we waited in silence. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the leaves and our uneven breathing. Then came a loud thud against the side of our tent. We all jumped, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What was that?" someone whispered. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had never experienced anything like this before. I slowly unzipped the tent, peeking out with the flashlight. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows. The campsite was empty, but something was off. The air was thick with tension. As I scanned the area, my light caught something on the ground, a trail of broken branches leading deeper into the woods. "Guys, I think we should go look for Tom," I said, my voice trembling. Against their better judgment, they agreed. We stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at our skin. I led the way, following the broken branches, heart pounding. We ventured further into the woods, the beam of my flashlight flickering nervously over the trees. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. I felt the weight of eyes on us, but I pushed the fear aside. Suddenly, we heard a low growl behind us. We spun around, but the flashlight only illuminated empty trees. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. We decided to head back to the campsite, our nerves fraying. When we arrived, my stomach dropped. Tom was sitting by the fire, calmly roasting marshmallows, a twisted grin on his face. "Where have you guys been?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. Relief washed over me, but a nagging fear lingered. "We thought you were in trouble," I said, still bewildered. His grin widened. "I was just having a little fun." That's when I noticed his hands were covered in dirt, like he had been digging. I looked around the campsite. The broken branches we followed were nothing compared to the strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding us, symbols I hadn't noticed before. As the fire flickered, casting ominous shadows, I felt something was terribly wrong. The forest was no longer the innocent backdrop to our camping trip. It had become a living entity, watching us, waiting for something. My heart raced as Tom turned to me, eyes gleaming, the smile of a man who knew something we didn't. And in that moment, I understood we were not alone. The night held secrets, and we had unknowingly stumbled into a nightmare from which there was no waking.